The narrative of Maria and Leo opens with their shared fondness for items possessing a history. In an age dominated by streamlined, Spartan aesthetics and ephemeral gadgets, they perceive charm in the abrasions, nicks, and narratives carried by antiquated objects. Their free time was frequently dedicated to meandering through open-air markets and vintage shops, hunting for valuables that had been disregarded by others. They were not merely accumulating possessions. They were amassing fragments of the past, palpable connections to the generations that had preceded them. It was on a brisk fall afternoon, during an extensive property liquidation at the town's perimeter, that their discovery was made. The residence itself was a relic of a bygone era, a location where chronology appeared to have paused sometime in the mid-20th century. Specks of dust swirled in the shafts of sunlight angling through the panes, casting light on furnishings veiled in white cloths. Sequestered in a faintly illuminated study, standing like a quiet, wooden guardian, was the radio. It was not a diminutive tabletop device. This was a magnificent console unit, a furnishing in its own right, fashioned from deep, lustrous walnut. Its facade was characterized by a substantial, woven speaker covering and a circular tuner, inscribed with the names of distant metropolises: Paris, Vienna, Moscow, Cairo. These were names that, in the 21st century, were simple travel destinations, but during the radio's prime, represented front lines and centers of conflict. Maria was captivated by its stately, elegant presence. Leo, a perennial aficionado of vintage electronics, was enthralled by its inner workings. He passed a hand across the sleek, cool wooden surface and cautiously rotated one of the sizable, Bakelite controls. It produced a gratifying, substantial click that contemporary plastics could never emulate. The vendor, a senior gentleman liquidating his parents' assets, informed them it had remained inactive for a minimum of 50 years. For $75, the item became theirs, a fragment of forsaken artisanship, slated to be an attractive, mute focal point in their main living space, or so they assumed. Transporting the weighty console to their home was a significant undertaking. They positioned it against the primary wall of their living area, where it instantly seemed as if it had always been there. For several days, it fulfilled its anticipated role as a topic of conversation. Visitors would praise its timeless aesthetic, its Art Deco contours, and the exquisite texture of the wood. Leo, however, found the challenge irresistible. He was set on determining if he could restore it to operation. He allocated an evening to meticulously examining the circuitry, substituting a worn power cable, and delicately removing the dust from the complex arrangement of vacuum tubes visible via the rear access panel. He elucidated to Maria the function of these tubes, explaining how they needed to heat up, emitting a faint glow like miniature embers, before the radio could produce any sound. It was a procedure, a ceremony, starkly different from the immediate functionality of their modern electronics. At last, the critical moment arrived. With a feeling of guarded optimism, Leo connected it to the power source. For a considerable period, there was no activity. A faint, deep hum permeated the space, the sound of aged electronics drawing current for the first time in a generation. Sequentially, the vacuum tubes started to emit a gentle amber luminescence. Maria and Leo positioned themselves on the floor before it, observing and anticipating. Leo adjusted the volume control. A powerful crackle burst from the speaker, succeeded by an ocean of static. It was the noise they anticipated, the sound of a radio scanning for a broadcast across a vacant frequency band. Leo started to leisurely rotate the large tuning control, moving across the frequencies. There was more static, the dim echo of a contemporary AM broadcast, and then further static. He was on the verge of surrendering, of resigning himself to the idea that it was merely a lovely but non-functional furnishing, when a shift occurred. Cutting through the sibilant static, a different sound started to manifest. It was not a current song or a radio personality. It was music. A resonant, brass-filled orchestra performed a swinging tune that felt simultaneously upbeat and curiously sad. It was a sound lifted directly from a classic black-and-white movie. They exchanged glances, bewildered yet fascinated. Perhaps they had chanced upon a niche station that specialized in vintage music. Leo carefully adjusted the tuner, and the static diminished further, the music growing clearer and more defined, though still shrouded in a distinctive crackle that signified its antiquity. The music concluded, and for a moment, there was only the low hiss of the carrier signal. Then, a man's voice permeated the room. It was a composed, deliberate, and notably formal voice, with an inflection they could not pinpoint but recognized from old newsreels. The announcer spoke, and his words sent a shiver down their spines, immobilizing them where they sat on their living room floor. He announced, "Good evening, America," from the Indigo Network. The date is December 9th, 1942. The atmosphere in the room turned dense and motionless. The sole sound was the crackle and hiss from the elegant wooden cabinet, and the poised, self-assured voice of a man who thought he was addressing a nation holding its collective breath. 1942. The words lingered between Maria and Leo, an inconceivable declaration that challenged all reason. Leo, the pragmatist, was the first to shatter the silence. He leaped to his feet, his face etched with intense focus. "This is a gag," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to Maria. "It must be some kind of hoax." He instantly seized his smartphone, its luminous display a jarring counterpoint to the gentle radiance of the radio's vacuum tubes. He began a frantic search. Unlicensed radio broadcasters in their vicinity. Vintage radio broadcast deceptions. Archival recordings of the Indigo Network. His fingers darted across the screen, a 21st century reaction to a 20th century enigma. Yet he discovered nothing. There were no known pirate broadcasters in their state committed to such a detailed, precise reenactment. No online communities mentioned a prank of this kind. The Indigo Network, he learned, had been an actual American radio network, a forerunner to the modern National Broadcasting Corporation, or NBC. However, it had stopped operating under that name in 1945. While Leo was immersed in the digital realm, Maria stayed on the floor, captivated. She was not attempting to disprove it. She was just listening. The news announcer's voice transitioned to another segment. Commercial. It was for a soap brand she had never encountered, vowing to keep hands supple for the diligent woman on the home front, accompanied by a bright jingle that felt both guileless and utterly foreign. Following that was the news. The announcer reported on naval conflicts near the Marshall Islands and the continuing military operations in southern Europe. He spoke of rationing, exhorting citizens to contribute to the war effort by conserving petrol and sugar. Each word, each detail, served as a brushstroke that painted a rich portrait of a world under profound duress. It was history, not as a sterile chapter in a textbook, but as a dynamic, living entity materializing in their living room. Leo finally set his phone aside, his expression one of frustration and confusion. "I have nothing," he stated, his voice a quiet murmur. "I have inspected the radio thoroughly. There are no concealed MP3 devices, no hidden transceivers, no modern electronics whatsoever. It consists solely of tubes, wires, and wood. It is precisely as it appears. An 8-decade-old radio." They sat together in quiet contemplation, listening. The broadcast was not a repetition. It was a continuous, diverse program. After the news, a dramatic play commenced, a tale of suspense and espionage featuring actors whose performances were overly theatrical by contemporary measures but completely engrossing. The sound effects, a groaning door, a far-off train's whistle, footsteps on a gravel path, were basic yet potent, crafting a theater of the imagination that enthralled them both. They were not merely hearing a transmission. They were partaking in the main form of nightly diversion for an entire generation of families. The show was cut short by a public service announcement. It was a solicitation for a war bond campaign, presented by a celebrated actress of the time. Her voice was unmistakable, a voice Maria had only ever encountered in classic movies on late-night television. To hear her speaking in this manner, as if she were live, just beyond the speaker covering, was deeply unsettling. It was as if the partition between their era and the past had grown permeable, thin enough for these voices to pass through. As the evening advanced, The broadcast proceeded on its course through a standard night of programming from 1942. There was additional music from big band conductors like Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman. There was a portion that presented letters from soldiers read aloud, communications of affection and yearning dispatched from across the globe. These were not fictional characters. They were actual people, their words a poignant testament to the human toll of the conflicts the announcer had so dispassionately detailed earlier. Leo, ever the rationalist, attempted to formulate a hypothesis. Could it be a sort of bizarre atmospheric phenomenon? A signal that had somehow ricocheted within the ionosphere for 80 years, only to find the ideal receiver at this precise moment? It seemed like science fiction, something from a series they might stream on their smart TV. But as he observed the glowing tubes of the vintage radio, a technology he barely comprehended, he had to concede he was beyond his expertise. The straightforward, elegant cabinet harbored a secret that his modern understanding could not decipher. As the late-night segment of the broadcast commenced, the atmosphere changed. A local news report aired, specific to the city where the radio was initially produced, hundreds of miles from their current location. The announcer cited street names they did not know and local happenings that were now mere historical footnotes. And then he cited a name. He was concluding a piece on community initiatives, acknowledging volunteers who assisted in a recent scrap metal collection. He stated, and a particular acknowledgement for the contributions of young Mr. Edward Pierce in coordinating the collection in the Elmwood district. The name was meaningless to them, but it was specific. It was a piece of evidence, a lead they could potentially follow in their own time. It was the first element of the enigma that was not just a voice from a bygone era, but a potential means to comprehend how and why it had found them. The mention of a distinct name, Edward Pierce, transformed the event from a passive, enigmatic occurrence into an active inquiry. The broadcast was no longer merely a portal to the past. It had become a trail of clues. Leo promptly found a notepad and pen, the traditional instruments suddenly seeming more suitable for the job than his smartphone. He meticulously recorded the name Edward Pierce and the mentioned area, Elmwood. The city of manufacture, which he knew from the maker's label on the radio's back, was also jotted down. A strategy started to take shape in his thoughts. The following morning, the radio remained silent. They had switched it off late the prior evening, half anticipating it would be gone by morning, like a dream that dissipates with the sunrise. But it was still present, a solid, real object. The query was, would it transmit again? With a mutual expression of eagerness, they activated it. The recognizable hum resumed, the tubes heated, and the static hissed. Leo cautiously adjusted the tuner to the precise position it had occupied the previous night. Nothing. He moved the tuner back and forth, but they only discovered the standard, contemporary AM broadcasts of their own era. The conduit, it appeared, had closed. Disappointment was mixed with a sense of relief. The event had been exhilarating but also profoundly disquieting. Had it all been a collective fantasy? A peculiar, singular event they would never be able to account for? But they possessed the note, the name, Edward Pierce. Their attention shifted from the radio itself to the clue it had provided. The puzzle was no longer confined to the wooden console. It had extended into the physical world, into archives and official documents. Their initial move was to the internet, the contemporary source of all knowledge. Leo began with a wide-ranging search, pairing the name Edward Pierce with the radio city of origin. The findings were at first limited. The name was not rare, but locating the correct individual from 80 years prior was akin to finding a particular grain of sand on an immense shoreline. He refined the search, incorporating phrases like Elmwood District and 1942. And then he discovered something. A digital version of a local newspaper from that city, with the date December 12, 1942. The online archive was cumbersome. The scanned pages faded and often difficult to decipher. But there, in a small section on page 6 devoted to local news and wartime initiatives, was a brief report. Its title was District Patriots Contribute. The report described a successful scrap metal collection and named several volunteers who had enabled it. And there, midway through the list of names, was Edward Pierce. The radio had not been fabricating information. Maria, peering over his shoulder, experienced a fresh surge of chills. This was confirmation, tangible evidence. The name from the ghostly transmission was real, recorded in ink on a page from the past. It rendered the entire event more solid, more frighteningly authentic. They were not merely contending with an odd signal. They were establishing a connection with a verifiable point in history. Encouraged, they investigated further. They looked for census data, city directories, and yearbooks from the 1930s and 40s. Gradually, a picture of Edward Pierce started to form. He was born in 1925, which would have made him 17 years old in 1942. A young man at the edge of maturity, contributing to a war that would shape his generation. They located his high school yearbook picture. A solemn-faced young man with tidily arranged hair and a firm look stared back at them across the decades. He was authentic. He had a face. The following evening, they resolved to try the radio once more. A peculiar custom was developing. As twilight descended, they would approach the old console, uncertain of what, if anything, they would discover. They powered it on, underwent the now customary procedure of warming the tubes, and adjusted the tuner. The static crackled. But on this occasion, as they reached the enchanted position on the tuner, a voice came through almost instantly. It was the same announcer from the Indigo Network, but the date he declared was different. December 10th, 1942. It was recurring. The radio was not rebroadcasting the same program. It was advancing in chronological order, as if it were an actual radio in 1942, simply being activated for another evening of listening. A fresh set of questions enveloped them. Was the radio somehow linked to a definite timeline? Did it operate only during the night? Was there a sense to this phenomenon? That night's broadcast was as captivating as the first. They heard news about the creation of a new synthetic rubber to support the war effort, a critique of President Roosevelt's most recent fireside address, and a well-liked comedy program that made them laugh at jests nearly a century old. The comedy was of a different style, more dependent on puns and absurd scenarios than the cynicism and irony of their own time, but it was fundamentally human. It was another point of connection, a signal that the people of the past were not just somber figures in monochrome photographs. They laughed, they fretted, and they looked for diversion and entertainment, just as they did. And then, another piece of evidence surfaced. It appeared during a segment of Personal Communications, a show intended to link loved ones divided by the war. An announcer delivered a brief message to Private Robert Sutton, based at Fort Bragg. Your mother wishes for you to know that she is in good health. She includes you in her prayers each night, and that your beloved Clara awaits your return. The message was straightforward, one of thousands that must have been transmitted over the airwaves during those years. But the name Clara struck a chord with Maria. She returned to the digital archives, this time looking for Edward Pierce's relatives. Census records showed he had an elder sister. Her name was Clara Pierce. Could this be the same Clara? The sweetheart of a soldier named Robert Sutton? The enigma was becoming more intricate, more intimate. It was no longer merely about a historical occurrence. It was about a family. The Pierces, Edward, the young patriot, Clara, the anxious sweetheart. These were no longer just names. They were figures in a drama playing out 80 years in the past, and Maria and Leo were the exclusive audience. They started to feel a peculiar sense of duty, a desire to learn what became of these individuals. Did Robert Sutton return home to Clara? What happened to young Edward? The antique radio was no longer just an object of fascination and mystery. It was a conduit for human narratives, and they felt a powerful urge to discover how those narratives concluded. The nightly custom persisted. Every evening, as the world beyond their window fell into the cadence of the 21st century, Maria and Leo would withdraw into the amber radiance of the radio, journeying back in time, one day at a time. December 11th, 1942. December 12th. The broadcasts turned into their secret, a mutual experience that was impossible to convey to anyone else. They were leading a dual existence. One in the present, with careers and companions and contemporary worries, and another in the past, as silent witnesses to the world of the Pierce family. They gleaned more about the family through the bits of information transmitted over the air. An announcer noted the local high school's winter performance, praising the orchestra for their show and singling out the lead clarinetist, Edward Pierce, for special recognition. Maria and Leo envisioned the solemn young man from the yearbook picture, not just as a contributor, but as a performer, a boy with interests and abilities beyond the stark circumstances of the war. They heard another message for Private Robert Sutton, this time from Clara herself, her words presumably read by the announcer, informing him she had gotten his most recent letter and that everyone at home was thinking of him. The emotional gravity of these broadcasts started to influence them. The war, which had previously been a historical topic for them, became immediate and intimate. They found themselves heeding the news reports with a feeling of unease, aware that the names of the battles and the casualty figures were not merely data, but stood for actual people like Robert Sutton. The commercials for war bonds, the appeals to conserve materials, the patriotic melodies. It all merged to form a climate of shared apprehension and determination that they could perceive through the speaker. Their inquiry into the Pierces grew more intense. Online databases could only provide so much. It was time to transition from the digital sphere to the physical one. They chose to take a road excursion to the radio city of origin, a 6-hour journey away. Their aim was to go to the local library and historical archives, to try and find more concrete links to Edward and Clara. The city had transformed profoundly in 80 years, but as they entered the older section of town, they could discern the echoes of the past in the building styles and the street configurations. Their initial destination was the public library. In the serene, musty archives section, enveloped by the scent of aged paper, they felt like genuine investigators. They began with old city directories. After checking against the census information, they located the Pierce family's address in the Elmwood district. It was a genuine location, a house that could still be standing. The idea was thrilling. Following that, they examined microfilms of the local paper, scanning through the weeks of December 1942. They located the article about the scrap metal collection that they had viewed online, but possessing the physical record, observing it within the context of the entire newspaper page, made it more authentic. They saw advertisements for films that were showing, social notices, and war reports, all encircling the minor mention of Edward. They were navigating his world, one page at a time. Maria concentrated on the society columns, searching for any mention of Clara Pierce and Robert Sutton. She found it, a small engagement notice from the spring of 1942. It featured a photograph of the joyful pair. Clara was lovely, with gentle curls and a radiant, optimistic smile. Robert was dashing in his new army attire, appearing proud and slightly apprehensive. The text noted he was the son of Mr. and Mrs. George Sutton and was slated for deployment soon. Witnessing their faces, so full of anticipation for a future that was entirely uncertain, was profoundly affecting. It made the message she'd heard on the radio, "Clara awaits you," infinitely more sorrowful. Equipped with the address, they opted to drive to the Elmwood district. It was a peaceful, well-maintained area with streets lined by trees and homes that were unmistakably from the early 20th century. They located the street and then the house number. It was still standing. A humble, 2-story residence with a broad front porch. It appeared much as it likely did 80 years prior, though there was now a contemporary automobile in the driveway. Someone else's existence was now unfolding within those walls. They refrained from knocking. It seemed like a trespass, a breach of both the current occupant's privacy and the specters of the past. They simply parked on the opposite side of the street and observed the house, envisioning a 17-year-old Edward departing for his clarinet practice, or Clara seated on that porch, perusing a letter from her beloved overseas. This was the place where the radio had resided. It had been situated in one of those rooms, transmitting these voices, these narratives, into the atmosphere. Had Edward himself listened to the same broadcasts they were now hearing? The notion was staggering. As they remained there, Leo had an insight. The estate sale where they had acquired the radio, it was located on the periphery of their own town, not this city 6 hours distant. So how did the radio travel from this residence to that estate sale? The vendor had stated he was liquidating his parents' home. Could there be a link? They journeyed back in a state of quiet reflection, the elements of the enigma spinning in their thoughts. That evening, back in their own living room, they activated the radio once more. The date declared was December 14th, 1942. The program was a combination of music and news, but then a special report arrived, a bulletin that broke into the regular programming. The announcer's tone was more grave than before. He reported on a significant naval engagement, a hard one but tactical triumph for the Allies. And then he started to recite a preliminary list of local men who were reported as missing in action. Maria and Leo held their breath. They listened as the announcer recited name after name, each one a powerful impact. The list was extensive, and near its conclusion, the announcer uttered a name that caused the air in their living room to turn to ice. Private Robert Sutton. The announcer's voice carried on, proceeding to the subsequent name, but for Maria and Leo, the world had come to a halt. Private Robert Sutton, missing in action. The words, spoken with the formal solemnity of a past time, resonated in the abrupt, deep quiet of their living room. The optimistic expression of the young man in the engagement picture appeared in their thoughts. Clara's smile, the message on the radio, filled with hope and yearning, now seemed a tragic forerunner. They were hearing the precise moment a family's existence was fractured by a piece of calamitous news. Maria felt tears form in her eyes. It was one matter to read about lists of casualties in a history text. It was an entirely different experience to hear a name one had come to recognize, to hear the news as it was conveyed to a town, to a family, to a sweetheart waiting by her radio. The division between past and present felt wholly absent in that instant. They were no longer mere spectators. They felt like participants in mourning. The vintage radio, once an object of fascination, now seemed to be a container of grief. They listened to the remainder of the broadcast, but their concentration had vanished. The lively music and cheerful commercials that came after the news bulletin appeared macabre, a bizarre contrast of fabricated happiness and real-life catastrophe. How could the world simply proceed after news of that nature? But it did. That was the state of the home front, a state they were now undergoing with a disturbing closeness. When the broadcast concluded for the night and they deactivated the radio, the quiet it left in its wake was more oppressive than ever. The following day, they felt a renewed, almost frantic, compulsion for resolution. The puzzle was no longer centered on a peculiar radio transmission. It concerned what transpired with the Pierce family following that dreadful news. Did Robert Sutton ever return? What was Clara's fate? And what of Edward, the young musician who was now the head of the household, left to console his sister in her sorrow? Leo pursued the trail of his latest idea, the estate sale. The vendor had been liquidating his parents' residence. He located the original online advertisement for the sale. Contained a name, Peter Olson. A swift search of public documents and death notices led them to a recent passing for a man named Peter Olson, and another for his wife, Anna Olson, a few years before. Leo continued his search, seeking Anna's maiden name. And then he discovered it. It was Pierce. Anna Pierce Olson. The elements fell into place with a shocking lucidity. Anna must have been a relative, but the census data they had found for the Pierce family in 1940 showed only 2 children, Clara and Edward. Who was Anna? Was she a younger sister, born after the census was taken? They broadened their search, looking for birth certificates from the mid-1940s. They found none. Disheartened, Leo attempted a new strategy. He searched for Edward Pierce's records from after the war. He located a university registration record from 1946, and then a marriage certificate from 1950. Edward Pierce had wed a woman named Grace, and in the early 1950s they had a daughter. They named her Anna. It was Edward's daughter, Anna Pierce Olson, the woman whose estate sale they had attended. The radio had not just been owned by the Pierce family. It had been handed down from Edward to his daughter, Anna. And Anna's son, Peter's and Anna's son, was the elderly gentleman who had sold it to them. They had acquired the radio from the grandson of Edward Pierce. The link was direct, intimate, and astounding. The radio had passed through the family and in some way found its way to them, two absolute strangers, to recount its tale. This fresh information altered everything. It made them feel even more profoundly connected to the family's destiny. That night, they approached the radio with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. They understood the broadcasts could not go on indefinitely. The timeline was advancing. What would occur when they arrived at the story's conclusion? They activated it. The date declared was December 18th, 1942. A week and a half had elapsed in the past since they had first discovered the broadcast. The content was somber. There was holiday music, but it was imbued with a deep sadness. Hymns about peace on earth seemed painfully incongruous against the backdrop of the war reports, which remained bleak. There were no further personal messages for Robert Sutton. There was only a quiet recognition of the local families who were experiencing grief during the holiday period. And then, a new type of message was broadcast. It was not from the Indigo Network's national transmission. It was a local station identifier, the same one they had heard when Edward's name was first mentioned. A different announcer with a warmer, less formal tone spoke. He stated he had a special, concluding announcement for the evening. He discussed the capacity of radio to unite people, to offer solace in trying times. He spoke about the community and the ties that bound it together. And then he stated, "We have one final piece of music for you tonight. It is a special request, dedicated to all those who are awaiting the return of loved ones. It is also dedicated to a young woman in our community, Clara Pierce, as a message of hope from her brother, Edward." A quietness descended over the airwaves, and then the distinct, clear sound of a lone clarinet began to play. There was no orchestra, only the solo instrument. It performed a slow, exquisitely poignant version of "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The tune was straightforward, but the execution was filled with an emotion that moved beyond time. It was a sound full of grief, yet resolute in its hope. It was a brother's musical consolation for his sorrowful sister. Maria and Leo sat, hardly daring to breathe, as the final note lingered in the air, played with a soft, diminishing exhalation. They knew, with complete certainty, that they were hearing 17-year-old Edward Pierce. This was not a pre-recorded piece being played by the station. This was him, live in the broadcast studio, channeling all of his affection and sorrow and hope into his instrument. When the piece concluded, the announcer returned, his voice heavy with emotion. That was Edward Pierce on the clarinet. "Good night, and may you all have a peaceful Christmas." The broadcast dissolved into static. Leo adjusted the tuner, but there was nothing. He switched the radio off and on again. Only static remained. The conduit had closed, and on this occasion they understood it was permanent. The narrative had been shared. The message had been received.